Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling episode of Midnight Tales, the podcast that brings you stories from the dark corners of imagination, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Tonight's tale, Grave Mistake, will take you into the heart of a small town, where a group of teenagers learns that even the most reckless actions can have terrifying consequences. They thought it was just a prank, a harmless dare at a haunted graveyard, but they quickly found out that some spirits refused to rest in peace. Before we dive in, I want to remind you to visit our website at midnighttales.org for more eerie stories, exclusive content, and ways to support the show. And of course, if you enjoy what you hear, please share Midnight Tales with your friends, like, and subscribe to help keep the stories coming. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare for Grave Mistake. The graveyard was a kingdom of crooked shadows that Halloween night, the air thick with a chill that curled around the bones like an unwelcome hand. For teenagers stood by the rusting gate. Alex, the self-appointed leader, his bravado unwavering as he took a swig from a flask. Jess, her arms crossed in defiance against the cold, a cigarette dangling from her lips. Mike, wide-eyed and shivering, more from nerves than the temperature, his eyes darting to the shadows. And Sarah, her eyes flickering with unease, as if she could sense the eyes of the unseen upon them. "Come on, it's just an old grave," Alex said, a grin pulling at his lips that almost dared the others to question him. "It's not like Henry Caldwell's going to crawl out and shake our hands." His laugh echoed against the weathered tombstones, bouncing back in a way that made it sound more hollow than confident. They squeezed through the gap in the gate, stepping into the labyrinthine graveyard, where forgotten tombstones slanted at odd angles and weeds grew like skeletal fingers grasping at the sky. The moonlight spilled in, pale and spectral, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. The legend of Henry the Cleaver Caldwell had brought them here, drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and the kind of peer pressure that only felt thrilling under the veil of darkness. Caldwell, the mass murderer whose name still brought hushed whispers in town, was said to be bound to this very spot, unable to leave, his spirit tethered by the weight of his crimes. Sarah shivered as they approached the grave, a slab of stone marked with Caldwell's name, half buried under moss and grime. It was an ugly, mean thing, the kind of headstone that seemed more a warning than a tribute. Jess scoffed, her voice cutting through the uneasy silence. "Seriously, this is what everyone's afraid of? It's just a rock." She kicked at the gravestone, the impact causing an audible crack. The sound was sharp, unnatural, like the snapping of old bones. A murder of ravens suddenly burst from a nearby tree, their wings flapping violently into the night sky. The teenagers froze, startled, but just shrugged it off with a nervous chuckle, her boots scraping across the worn inscription. Alex knelt, pulling out a spray can from his backpack. "All right, let's make sure Caldwell knows we stopped by." He shook the can, the rattle echoing in the quiet, before spraying a crude, smiley face on the stone, his strokes deliberate, mocking. The others watched, a mix of amusement and apprehension passing between them. Mike shifted from foot to foot, his eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to be inching closer. The wind picked up suddenly, a low, mournful whistle that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It rustled the leaves, making them sound like the dry, crackling laughter of something unseen. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Hear what?" Alex said, not bothering to look up, his chalk still scratching against the stone. "It's just the wind, Sarah. Don't chicken out now." But the wind didn't sound right. It carried something with it, a whisper, a murmur that seemed to dance just at the edge of comprehension. Mike's face went pale, his eyes widening as he strained to listen. It was a voice, or maybe many voices, all layered atop one another, echoing from the depths of the graveyard. Jess opened her mouth to make a joke, but the words died on her lips as the sound grew louder, more insistent. A chorus of disembodied voices that seemed to swell up from beneath their feet. "Okay, that's enough," Sarah said, her voice trembling, her eyes fixed on the gravestone as if expecting Caldwell himself to claw his way out. "Let's just go." Alex stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. "Fawn, don't get all jumpy on me." He turned to the others, a smirk still plastered on his face, But there was an edge to his eyes now, a flicker of doubt. They turned and made their way back to the gate, their footsteps crunching over the gravel path. The whispers faded, replaced by the rustle of dead leaves and the creaking of the gate as they slipped back through. None of them spoke, their laughter swallowed by the heavy silence that hung over the graveyard. As they left, the camera of an unseen observer might have lingered, watching the cracked gravestone. The jagged line where Jess's kick had split it, a hairline fracture that ran deep, deeper than any of them could know. And beneath the earth, something stirred, awakened by the laughter and the arrogance of those who thought the dead were powerless. The days that followed Halloween seemed oddly still, but the teenagers barely noticed. They were too busy replaying the thrill of that night, making jokes about Caldwell's supposed haunting and brushing off any unease with careless laughter. The graveyard was just a spooky backdrop for their mischief, nothing more, or so they convinced themselves. But as the week went on, the weather began to change. A cold shift in the air settled over the town, and storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising something dark and unsettled. Sarah, despite her best efforts to forget the graveyard, found herself growing restless. She'd laugh along with the others, but at night when she was alone, the thrill gave way to something else, a discomfort she couldn't quite name. It was subtle at first, like the sense of someone standing just behind her, gone when she turned to look. She would lie in bed, staring at the shadows on her ceiling, feeling as if they were watching her, waiting. It was one of those nights when the unease crept up on her again. She decided to take a shower to try and clear her mind. After her shower, the bathroom mirror began to fog, the steam thick in the cold air. Slowly, shapes started to form in the condensation. First, a crude smiley face, like the one Alex had spray painted on Caldwell's gravestone, and then, just below it, the words, "Thank you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her mouth going dry. She wiped at the glass, her hands trembling, trying to erase the symbols, but they lingered, a faint outline barely visible, mocking her. And somewhere almost too faint to be real, she heard a whisper, a soft, sibilant voice that sent a chill straight through her. She turned off the bathroom light and hurried to her room, her pulse echoing in her ears. Jess, meanwhile, was making light of the whole thing, cracking jokes about Caldwell whenever she could, and texting gifts from B-movies of spirits being set free from tombstones being destroyed, like the curse of a mummy. She enjoyed being the one who wasn't scared, the one who refused to let ghost stories get to her. But even Jess couldn't entirely shake the strange feeling that things were different. It started small, little things, like her cigarette lighter disappearing and reappearing in bizarre places. She joked that her house had a poltergeist, but it didn't explain why her younger brother had started acting so strange. He used to follow her around the house, pestering her with questions or begging her to play video games. Now, he just stared. He would stand in the hallway, silent, his eyes following her every move. When Jess snapped at him to cut it out, he'd only smile, a vacant, unnerving smile that made her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite rationalize. One night, as she lay in bed scrolling on her phone, she heard it, a whisper, soft but insistent, coming from somewhere outside her room. She paused, pulling out her earbuds, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. It wasn't her brother's voice, nor her mother's. It was low, almost like a murmur, threading through the silence of the house. She opened her door, her eyes scanning the empty hallway, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, the quiet, and the cold. "Get a grip," she muttered, closing the door. But as she turned back toward her bed, her eyes caught a movement in the mirror, a shadow flitting across the room behind her. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat, but there was nothing. Only her own reflection staring back, her eyes wide and frightened. Jess tried to laugh it off the next day, telling Alex and Mike that her house must be haunted, her voice filled with forced bravado. Alex laughed, slapping her on the back, while Mike just nodded, his face pale and his eyes distant. They hadn't heard from Sarah in a couple of days, and Jess found herself wondering if she should check on her. But she pushed the thought away. Sarah was probably just sick, and anyway, what could she even say? That she thought a ghost was messing with them? It sounded ridiculous, even to her. Outside, the sky darkened, the air heavy with the promise of a storm. The town itself seemed to grow quieter, as if waiting for something to happen. And still, none of them wanted to admit that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't walked away from the graveyard alone. Mike slouched on the couch, his eyes half focused on the evening news as the anchor's voice droned on, the blue light of the TV flickering in the dim living room. His parents sat on either side of him, their attention rapt. He picked at the fabric of his jeans, only half listening until the anchor's tone shifted, lower, graver. He glanced up, the words cutting through his haze of boredom. Tonight in local news, a shocking tragedy has struck our community. Police report that a father of two brutally murdered his family late last night. Authorities were called to the scene after neighbors heard screams. What they found was, the anchor paused, her eyes betraying a hint of unease. What they found was unlike anything this town has seen in decades. Mike felt a chill crawl up his spine. He sat up straighter, his gaze fixed on the screen now as images flashed, the front of a modest suburban house, police tape fluttering in the wind, flashing lights reflecting off the windows. The anchor continued, detailing how the father, a man known by neighbors as kind and soft-spoken, had suddenly turned violent, attacking his family in a frenzy. The words unexplained, horrific, and no prior history of violence echoed through the room. His mother let out a small gasp, her hand coming up to her mouth. "My God," she whispered, her eyes wide as she glanced at Mike's father. How could something like this happen here? Mike swallowed, his throat dry. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he opened the group chat with Jess, Alex, and Sarah. He typed quickly, "Mike, guys, did you see the news?" A few moments later, Jess responded. "Jess, yeah, what the hell is going on?" Alex, "Probably just some psycho. But damn, that's messed up." Mike hesitated, then typed, "Mike, you think it could be, Caldwell?" There was a long pause before Sarah's name popped up. The three dots blinked in and out as she typed, stopped, then typed again. "Sarah, I don't know, but something weird happened the other night. In my bathroom." Mike frowned, his eyes glued to the screen. Jess was quicker to respond. "Jess, what do you mean weird?" "Sarah, I didn't want to say anything, but after I showered, the mirror fogged up, and there was a smiley face. And the words, 'Thank you.' I thought maybe it was a joke or just my mind playing tricks. But now, I don't know." Mike felt his stomach twist. He stared at Sarah's message, rereading it, hoping he'd misunderstood. His parents were still talking, their voices filled with concern, but it all seemed distant now, muffled under the pounding of his heart. "Mike, are you serious?" "Sarah, I tried to forget it, but I swear it happened." "Jess, this is getting too creepy. Do you think it's connected?" "Alex, come on, it's just some messed up coincidence. Ghosts aren't real, right?" Mike wasn't so sure anymore. The memory of the graveyard, the cracked gravestone, the chill that had settled over them, it all felt too real, too heavy to be just a coincidence. Only a few days later, the news was worse. Another brutal murder, this time a young couple found dead in their apartment. The details were scarce, but the anchor's voice trembled as she spoke of the scene, the violence, the inexplicable nature of it all. Mike watched in silence, his parents beside him once again, their faces etched with worry. His phone buzzed on his lap. "Jess, guys, another one. This is getting really freaky." "Sarah, it's him. I know it." Mike stared at the message, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. He wanted to tell Sarah she was wrong, that it was just a random tragedy, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, a part of him knew that they had done something that night, something they shouldn't have. "Mike, what if we actually let him out? What if Caldwell's really back?" There was a pause, then Alex replied, his bravado noticeably absent. "Alex, we need to figure this out. What if it's not just a coincidence?" For the first time since Halloween, the group fell silent. No jokes, no bravado, just the gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, they had brought something dark back with them. And now the storm was about to break. The town seemed to be holding its breath, the uneasy silence thickening as the days dragged on. The news had begun to blur, each report seemingly worse than the last. And with each new murder, the sense of dread gnawed deeper at Mike's mind. He had to know if there was a connection, if Caldwell's spirit was really behind this. He spent hours hunched over his computer, trawling through old newspapers and articles, piecing together Caldwell's history, as if the answers were hidden somewhere in the grainy photographs and yellowing headlines. The murders, it turned out, weren't random. Each one had a pattern, a theme. Henry the Cleaver Caldwell hadn't just killed his family. He had killed many, each in twisted, brutal ways. The first murder had been a father slaughtering his family with a cleaver, eerily reminiscent of Caldwell's own crime. The second murder, a young couple found poisoned in their apartment, was almost an exact mirror of the way Caldwell had taken out a rival in the 1950s. A methodical poisoning, slow and deliberate. Mike sat in his room, the glow of his computer screen the only light in the darkness, as he read over an old article detailing Caldwell's spree. His heart pounded as he saw the similarities, the echoes of the past that seemed to be resurfacing now in the present. He grabbed his phone and opened the group chat. Mike, guys, I've been researching Caldwell. These murders, they're just like the ones he committed. Same methods. It took a few minutes, but soon the others began to reply. Jess, are you serious? It's just a coincidence, Mike. People kill each other all the time. Alex. Yeah, Jess is right. You're just spooking yourself. Caldwell's dead. He's not doing this. Mike clenched his jaw, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. Mike, no, listen. The cleaver, the poison. Caldwell used these exact methods. It's too similar to ignore. Sarah, what if it is him? What if we really did let him out? The message hung there unanswered, as if none of them wanted to acknowledge it. Mike could almost hear the silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Jess responded. Jess, this is nuts. I mean, ghosts aren't real, right? We didn't actually bring him back. It's just people being messed up. Alex, yeah, come on. There has to be some other explanation. Mike sighed, shaking his head. He could understand why they wanted to dismiss it. It was easier that way. But he knew what he'd read, what he'd seen. The eerie parallels, the similarities that couldn't just be coincidence. The third murder happened that weekend. A lone woman, strangled in her home with a piece of electrical cord. Mike's stomach twisted as he read the news article, his eyes scanning the details. Caldwell had strangled one of his victims too, using a length of rope. He'd done it slowly, methodically, watching the life drain from their eyes. The brutality, the eeriness of the parallel sent a shiver through Mike. He shared the details with the group. Mike, another one. Strangled this time. Caldwell did this too. It's the same. Jess responded almost immediately. Jess, okay, this is getting weird. But still, it could be anything. It doesn't mean it's him. Sarah, how can you say that? We cracked his gravestone. We mocked him. It's our fault. Mike felt a pang of guilt, Sarah's words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down he knew she might be right. They had disturbed something that night, something they shouldn't have. And now, it was like a shadow over their town, creeping closer with each passing day. The fourth murder happened only a few days later. A young man found in his car, his throat slit ear to ear. Mike's hand shook as he read the report, a sense of dread coiling tighter inside him. Caldwell had killed in this way too, a young drifter who had crossed his path. It was the same brutality, the same cold precision. It was impossible to ignore now, impossible to dismiss. He messaged the group again. Mike, this isn't just coincidence. It's happening exactly like Caldwell did it. We have to do something. There was a long pause before Sarah finally responded. Sarah, I agree. We need to figure this out before more people die. We have to stop it. Jess and Alex were slower to respond, their reluctance evident. Alex, okay, let's say you're right. What do we do? How do you stop a ghost? Jess, yeah, I mean, this isn't a movie. We don't know anything about ghosts or whatever. Sarah, maybe Father O'Malley could help. He knows about this stuff, right? Jess, Father O'Malley? You mean that weirdo priest who keeps talking about demons and ghosts? Alex, yeah, the guy's a bit out there. My mom says he's controversial, not because of the usual stuff, but because he actually believes in all that supernatural crap. Jess, didn't he write books about that too? Like Demons Among Us or something. He's totally the kind of guy people avoid at the grocery store. Sarah, I know, but if anyone knows what's going on, it might as well be him. Mike, honestly, he might be our best shot, even if he is kind of a weirdo. Alex, all right, fine. Let's talk to him. I guess it can't hurt. Mike nodded to himself, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Maybe they could fix this. Maybe it wasn't too late. But as he looked out his window at the darkened sky and the shadows that seemed to loom closer, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already running out of time. The church loomed ahead of them, a shadowy silhouette against the stormy sky. The stained glass windows glowed faintly from the light within, casting muted colors onto the wet pavement. The four teenagers stood at the bottom of the stone steps, each of them hesitating for a moment longer than they wanted to admit. The wind whipped at their jackets, and Mike took a deep breath, his eyes flicking towards the heavy wooden doors. You sure about this, Mike? Jess asked, her voice betraying just a hint of nervousness. She adjusted her hoodie, trying to shield herself from the cold. I mean, this guy is, well, he's not exactly the most normal person. Yeah, we know. But it's not like we have a lot of options, Mike replied, his voice low. If anyone knows how to deal with whatever this is, it's going to be him. Sarah nodded, her expression serious. He's written books about this kind of stuff. Ghosts, demons, possessions. He might be our best shot at understanding what's going on. Alex snorted, shoving his hands into his pockets. Yeah, or he'll think we're just a bunch of dumb kids messing with him. He looked up at the darkened church, a flicker of doubt passing across his face. But whatever. Let's just get this over with. They climbed the steps together, their footsteps echoing on the stone. Mike reached for the handle, hesitating for a moment before pulling the door open. It creaked loudly, and they stepped inside, the warmth of the church washing over them in stark contrast to the cold wind outside. The air smelled of old wood and incense, the kind of scent that clung to the walls of a place that had seen centuries of prayers and secrets. Father O'Malley stood at the front, his back to them as he arranged a set of candles on the altar. He was a tall, thin man with a shock of silver hair, his black robes hanging loosely on his frame. He turned as he heard the door close, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of the teenagers. For a moment, he simply watched them, his gaze assessing, as if he could read the weight of their troubles in their expressions. Father O'Malley? Mike called out, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, stepping forward. We need your help. The priest raised an eyebrow, his eyes shifting from one face to the next. Help. From me. He paused, his voice calm but curious. You lot don't look like you're here for confession. Jess exchanged a glance with Alex, rolling her eyes slightly. No, we're not here for that, she muttered under her breath. Sarah took a step forward, her eyes earnest. It's about Henry Caldwell. We think we might have disturbed his spirit. Father O'Malley's expression didn't change, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. Interest, perhaps, or recognition. He gestured for them to come closer, motioning towards the front pews. Sit down, he said, his voice soft but commanding. Tell me everything. They sat, the wooden benches creaking under their weight. Mike swallowed hard, glancing at the others before he began. He told Father O'Malley about the dare, about Halloween night, about Caldwell's grave and the crack in the headstone. He spoke quickly, the words tumbling out, as if saying them faster would make them less real. The others chimed in, Sarah with the fog mirror and the writing, Jess with the whispers, Alex reluctantly admitting that maybe, just maybe, something was going on that they couldn't explain. Father O'Malley listened without interrupting, his face calm but attentive. When they finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting towards the altar. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. Henry Caldwell was a man who embraced evil. His crimes left a stain not just on this town, but on his very soul. He turned back to them, his eyes sharp. You say you cracked his gravestone? You mocked him? Mike nodded, his face pale. We didn't think. We thought it was just a story, just some old legend. Father O'Malley's face twisted with a mix of fear and anger, his shoulders tensing as he stared at the teenagers. Do you have any idea what you've done? He snapped, his voice rising, a rare crack in his usually calm demeanor. Henry Caldwell was not just some story to frighten children. He was evil incarnate. And you went and disturbed his grave? Mocked him? What were you hoping to achieve? He took a deep breath, his chest heaving, before turning abruptly towards a cabinet behind the altar. His hand shook slightly as he opened it, revealing rows of old books, their spines cracked and faded. He pulled one out, flipping through the pages with an urgency, muttering under his breath. If Caldwell's spirit has been disturbed, and if he's grown powerful enough to influence the living, then you have indeed unleashed something dangerous. He looked up, his expression grave. There may be a way to bind him again, to force his spirit back. But it will not be easy, and it will not be without risk. Sarah swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. We have to try. We didn't realize it was real. We're sorry, Father. We just want to help fix this. We can't let more people die because of us. The others nodded in agreement, their faces pale but resolute. Jess spoke up, her voice uncharacteristically soft. We know we messed up, but if there's anything we can do, we'll do it. Alex shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. Yeah, we just want to make this right. Father O'Malley nodded, his eyes softening slightly. Very well. We will need certain things, items for the ritual. And you must be prepared for what may come. Caldwell's spirit will not go quietly. The teenagers exchanged uneasy glances, but there was a determination in their eyes now. They realized they might be unwillingly responsible for several murders in their town. They had blood on their hands, and the weight of that guilt drove them. They had started this, and they would see it through no matter the cost. Father O'Malley paced back and forth in the small, dimly lit room at the back of the church. The candles flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. He had laid out an assortment of old tomes, herbs, candles, and a few other items whose purpose wasn't immediately clear to the teenagers. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, a smoky reminder of the sacred space they were in. Listen to me and listen well, Father O'Malley said, his voice taut, his eyes locked on each of the teenagers in turn. This ritual is not without risk. Caldwell is powerful. His spirit has grown stronger from the fear and the chaos, and he will not go quietly. There is no backup plan, no second chance. Once we begin, there is no turning back. He paused, letting his words sink in, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them like a weight. Mike swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the others. Jess shifted uncomfortably, her face paling as she looked at the various ritual items. Sarah clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white, and Alex's bravado had all but disappeared. They were here, but the fear was real, palpable. You need to understand something very important, Father O'Malley continued, his eyes narrowing. I cannot protect you from Caldwell. Only you can protect yourselves. You must stick together throughout the ritual. No matter what happens, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you must not break the circle. If any one of you falters, it will all be for nothing, and Caldwell will take full advantage of that weakness. He stopped pacing, turning to face them fully. His expression was severe, but there was something else there too, something almost like compassion. He will try to deceive you. He will use your fears against you. He will make you see things, hear things that will try to drive you apart. You must not let that happen. You must trust each other, and you must trust in the ritual. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. What if one of us can't do it? What if we're too scared? Father O'Malley's gaze softened slightly, and he nodded. Fear is natural. Anyone in your situation would be terrified. But you need to remember why you're doing this. The lives lost, the blood on your hands, this is your chance to set things right. You've already faced more than most people could imagine, and you're still here. That tells me you have the strength to see this through. Alex let out a shaky breath, his voice unsteady. So what exactly do we need to do? The priest gestured to the items laid out before them. We will go to Caldwell's grave. You will form a circle around it, and I will guide you through the ritual. These herbs will be burned to purify the area, And these symbols, he pointed to a series of intricate designs drawn on parchment, will be painted on the ground to bind a spirit. You will need to chant with me, and no matter what happens, you cannot stop until it is done. Jess glanced at the others, her expression grim. And if we fail? Father O'Malley's face hardened, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. If you fail, Caldwell's spirit will be free to do as he pleases. He will grow even stronger, and more people will die. There will be nothing left to stop him. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them like a crushing force. Mike looked at each of his friends, their faces etched with fear, but also determination. They had come this far and they couldn't turn back now. Not with everything that was at stake. Father O'Malley nodded, as if reading their resolve. He picked up a small vial filled with a dark liquid, holding it out to Mike. This is holy oil. Use it to mark your foreheads before we begin. It will offer some protection, but remember, ultimately, the strength you need will come from within. Mike took the vial, his hands trembling slightly as he nodded. Okay, we're ready. Father O'Malley gave them a final, searching look. Remember, stick together, trust each other, and do not break the circle. This is your only chance to put things right. The teenagers exchanged glances, a mixture of fear and determination in their eyes. They nodded, and together they followed Father O'Malley out of the room, the cold wind rushing in as they stepped out of the church and into the stormy night. This was it. The confrontation with the spirit they had awoken, and there would be no turning back. The storm had been brewing all day, and by the time they arrived at the graveyard, it had become a full-blown tempest. The wind whipped through the trees, howling like a chorus of angry spirits, and the rain came down in sheets, soaking them to the bone. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating the crooked headstones, casting eerie shadows across the graveyard. They trudged forward, their footsteps crunching on the wet gravel path, each of them quiet, lost in their own thoughts. The nerves were getting to them, the reality of what they were about to do sinking in with every step. Mike could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the fear clawing at him, but he knew they had to do this. There was no other option. They reached Caldwell's grave, the cracked headstone standing stark against the darkened sky. Father O'Malley set down the items he had brought, quickly instructing them on where to stand. They formed a circle around the grave, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Mike pulled out the vial of holy oil, his hands shaking as he unscrewed the cap. He passed it to each of them, watching as they marked their foreheads, the dark liquid glistening in the flickering light of the lantern Father O'Malley had lit. It felt ceremonial, almost surreal, as if they were stepping into another world, one filled with darkness and danger. Father O'Malley lit the herbs, the pungent smoke swirling up into the night. He began to chant, his voice steady, resonant, even against the roar of the storm. The teenagers joined in, their voices shaky at first, but gaining strength as they continued. The wind seemed to grow stronger, the ground vibrating beneath them as if the earth itself was responding to their call. And then, without warning, he appeared. Caldwell's ghost materialized within the circle, his form flickering like a bad signal, his eyes hollow and filled with malice. His face twisted in fury, as if he had been summoned against his will. The air grew colder still, the storm raging harder, the wind whipping their voices away as they chanted. Caldwell's mouth moved, but no sound came out, just a deep, guttural rage that seemed to reverberate inside their heads. Do not stop, Father O'Malley shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. Do not break the circle. Mike's heart pounded, his eyes locked on the specter before him. Caldwell's face seemed to shift, contorting, his eyes narrowing as he looked at each of them in turn. The temperature plummeted, the cold biting into their skin, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Jess's voice faltered for a moment, her eyes widening as Caldwell's gaze fixed on her, but Mike reached out, grabbing her hand, squeezing it tightly. Keep going, he urged, his own voice barely audible over the wind. They couldn't afford to fail. Not now, not when they had come this far. The ghost of Henry Caldwell roared, his form writhing as if fighting against some unseen force. The symbols on the ground began to glow, the light growing brighter, pushing against the darkness that Caldwell exuded. The teenagers continued their chant, their voices rising, louder, stronger, as they poured everything they had into the ritual. This was it, their only chance, and they would not turn back. The wind screamed through the graveyard, tearing at their clothes, their faces stinging from the cold. The chanting grew louder, each word a desperate plea against the presence of Caldwell's ghost. But even as they spoke, something shifted. Mike's voice faltered, his eyes glazing over, his body trembling. Suddenly, his gaze snapped upward, locking onto Jess with a cold, vacant stare. Jess barely had time to react before Mike lunged at her, his hands wrapping around her throat. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide in shock, her breath caught in her throat. Mike, stop, she choked, struggling against him, her feet slipping in the mud. Alex rushed forward, grabbing Mike's arm and yanking him away from Jess. But Mike's strength was unnatural, inhuman. He snarled, his face twisted with rage, his eyes black as night. "Mike, it's us," Alex shouted, his voice frantic as he fought to pull Mike off Jess. Together, Jess and Alex managed to throw Mike to the ground, but he didn't stay down for long. He was up again in an instant, his strength overpowering, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Father O'Malley's voice rang out, commanding, "Hold him down. Do not let him break the circle." Mike's face twisted, his mouth opening in a guttural scream. But it wasn't his voice that came out. It was Caldwell's, a low, menacing growl that seemed to reverberate inside their skulls. He swung at Alex, knocking him to the ground with a force that left him gasping for air. Jess scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she threw herself at Mike, her hands trying to restrain him, her nails digging into his arm. Suddenly, Mike's movements changed. He stopped attacking them and instead turned his aggression inward. He clawed at his own chest, his face twisted in pain, and then he lunged toward the cracked gravestone, as if trying to destroy it. His hands battered against the stone, his knuckles splitting, blood mixing with the rain as he screamed in Caldwell's voice, a desperate, angry sound that seemed to echo in the storm. Father O'Malley moved quickly, pulling a length of rope from his bag, rope that had been soaked in holy water. He wrapped it around Mike, pulling it tight, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Mike writhed, his body contorting, his face a mask of agony. "Keep chanting," Father O'Malley shouted, his voice hoarse from the wind and rain. Sarah's voice broke, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to stop. We have to save him." Father O'Malley's eyes were fierce as he turned to her, his expression grim. "This is the only way, Sarah. If we stop now, Caldwell will win. We have to finish this. It's the only way to save Mike." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, her voice trembling. "But is he going to be okay?" Father O'Malley hesitated, his gaze softening, the storm reflected in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But we have to try." Jess, her voice shaking, picked up the chant again, her eyes locked on Mike, who struggled against the rope, his body writhing in the mud. Alex joined in, his voice weak but determined, and finally, Sarah added hers, her heart breaking with every word. The symbols on the ground began to glow brighter, the light growing in intensity, pushing against the darkness that enveloped Mike. The ghost of Caldwell flickered, his form fading in and out, as if the storm itself was tearing at him, trying to pull him away. Mike let out a final, agonized scream as Caldwell's spirit was ripped from his body, the dark form swirling in the wind, desperately trying to latch onto one of the others. The ghost moved toward Jess, its eyes hollow and filled with malice, but it was weakened, too weak to hold on. It flickered, fading, its form dissolving like mist caught in a gale. The storm seemed to rise to a crescendo, the wind howling, the rain driving down in sheets, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Caldwell's ghost was gone. His presence lifted, the air suddenly still, the silence almost deafening. Mike lay on the ground, his body limp, his eyes closed. Sarah rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she touched his face. "Mike, Mike, can you hear me?" He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, confusion clouding his gaze. He looked up at Sarah, his voice weak. What happened?" Sarah let out a sob, relief washing over her. You're okay. You're okay. Father O'Malley knelt beside them, his face lined with exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. It's over. Caldwell is gone. The teenagers looked at one another, the weight of what they had just been through settling in, their breaths coming in shaky gasps. They had faced the darkness, and somehow they had survived. But they knew, deep down, that they would never be the same. The aftermath was a blur for Mike. He sat in his living room, his head resting against the back of the couch, a bandage wrapped tightly around his forehead. His parents hovered nearby, their faces creased with worry. They had asked him again and again what had happened, how he had ended up with bruises on his neck, cuts on his knuckles, and rope burns across his wrists. But he didn't have an answer that made any sense, at least not one that he could say out loud. It was just a stupid accident, he muttered, his eyes avoiding theirs, his voice flat. We were messing around and things got out of hand. His mother sighed, her eyes searching his face for any hint of the truth. But Mike just closed his eyes, his body sinking deeper into the couch. He wished he could tell them everything. That he and his friends had faced something dark and terrifying, something that had nearly destroyed them. But they wouldn't understand. They couldn't. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the town seemed to shift. The strange, brutal murders that had plagued the community suddenly stopped, as if whatever malevolent force had been behind them had simply vanished. The local news ran story after story, puzzled by the abrupt end to the violence, the headlines filled with words like mysterious, unexplained, and sudden calm. Mike watched the reports with a sense of numb relief, his fingers still trembling when he thought of Caldwell's ghost, the way it had twisted his body, forced him to turn against his friends. The memories were vivid, too vivid. He could still feel the coldness that had invaded him, the way his own mind had seemed to fade into the background as something else took over. The fear, the rage, it had all felt so real, so unstoppable. The group had stayed in contact, but it wasn't the same. Jess had laughed it off, her nervous energy coming through every time she tried to make a joke, but beneath the surface, the guilt weighed heavily on her. Alex, usually brash and cocky, had grown quiet, his eyes haunted by what they had seen and by the realization that their actions had led to the deaths of innocent people. And Sarah. Sarah had been the one who had held them together, her determination driving them forward. But even she seemed different now, her smile more subdued, her eyes distant, burdened by the knowledge that they had unleashed something terrible on their town. One night, they gathered at Sarah's house, a silent agreement that they needed to see each other again, if only to remind themselves that they were still here, that they had survived. They sat in her living room, the television flickering in the background, a news report running about the murders, the anchor's voice filled with bewilderment. And while authorities are still investigating, no new incidents have been reported in recent days. The town remains on edge, though some believe that the worst may be over. Authorities urge anyone with information to come forward. Sarah muted the TV, her eyes fixed on the dark screen for a long moment before she turned to the others. Do you think it's really over? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike shrugged, his eyes dropping to the floor. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, he's gone, right? We finished the ritual. Jess shifted uncomfortably, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Yeah, but I don't know. It just feels like something's still out there. Alex nodded, his gaze distant. It doesn't just go away. Not really. I think it's always going to be there. A part of us. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I mean, we were the ones who set him free. We were the reason all those people died. It was just supposed to be a stupid prank. We never thought it would lead to this. His eyes dropped, the guilt evident. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget that. They fell into silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, the weight of their experience settling heavily between them. The room felt too quiet, the shadows in the corners of the room darker than they should have been. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and for a moment, Mike thought he heard something else, something faint, almost like a whisper. He looked up, his eyes meeting Sarah's. She gave him a small, sad smile, her eyes tired. They had won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, and maybe that was enough. The camera of an unseen observer might have lingered on the group for a moment longer, then shifted away, moving back through the darkened streets, past the rows of houses, and towards the graveyard. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves, the cracked gravestones standing in the moonlight. And if someone listened closely, just closely enough, they might have heard it. A faint whisper carried on the breeze, the echo of something that refused to be forgotten. And so, dear listeners, the storm has passed, but something still lingers in the air, a whisper, an echo of what refuses to be forgotten. Our group of friends may have survived the night, but survival came with a cost. Guilt is a powerful burden, and the shadows of their actions will follow them forever, like a quiet reminder that not everything stays buried. Thank you for joining us tonight on Midnight Tales. If you enjoyed Grave Mistake, be sure to check out more episodes at midnighttales.org. Sharing these stories with others helps us continue to bring the supernatural and the strange straight to your ears. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. It makes a world of difference. Until next time, sleep well if you can.